Right now, somewhere in Japan, a bullet train is moving at 320 kilometers per hour. That's 200 miles per hour. There are about 1,300 people on board. They're drinking coffee. They're sleeping. Some of them are standing in the aisle. And all of that speed, all of that motion depends on a single copper wire hanging above the train. So here's the question. What happens if that wire goes dead? What happens if a train carrying 1,300 people, moving at 200 miles per hour, suddenly loses all electrical power? Most people imagine a disaster. The brakes fail. The train becomes a runaway missile. Sparks, screaming, a crash you can see from space. The real answer is much stranger than that. Because the truth is, a bullet train loses power all the time. On purpose. Several times per trip. And you've never noticed. But before we get to that, you need to understand what you're actually sitting inside when you board one of these things. A full-length Shinkansen, the Japanese bullet train, is about 400 meters long. That's a quarter of a mile of train, 16 cars, roughly 700 tons of steel, aluminum, and passengers. Now take those 700 tons and accelerate them to 320 kilometers per hour. At that speed, the train is covering the length of a football field every second. If you dropped a coin out the window, it would land almost 90 meters behind you. And the energy involved is hard to wrap your head around. The kinetic energy of a bullet train at full speed is close to 3 billion joules. That's roughly the energy released by 600 kilograms of TNT. It's enough energy to power an average American home for almost a month. All of it stored in pure motion. To keep that motion going, the train pulls electricity from an overhead wire called a catenary, charged at 25,000 volts. On the roof of the train sits a device called a pantograph, a spring-loaded arm that presses a carbon strip against that wire and holds contact while the train moves underneath it at 200 miles per hour. Think about that for a second. A piece of carbon, sliding along a copper wire, at highway times 3 speed, in rain, in snow, in crosswinds. And it has to maintain contact so precisely that the electrical connection almost never breaks. Almost. Because sometimes it does break. A bird strike, a snapped wire, an earthquake, a grid failure that blacks out half a region. And when that happens, 25,000 volts becomes 0 volts, instantly, while the train is still doing 320. So what actually happens in that moment? This is the part nobody expects. Almost nothing. The lights flicker and switch to battery power. The air conditioning drops to a lower setting, and the train just keeps going. No lurch, no alarm, no screaming. Most passengers wouldn't even look up from their phones, because 700 tons moving at 320 kilometers per hour has one defining characteristic. It does not want to stop. Steel wheels on steel rails have almost no rolling resistance. It's one of the reasons trains exist in the first place. A bullet train that loses power at full speed doesn't stall like a car. It coasts. And it coasts for a very, very long time. On flat, straight track, a Shinkansen that loses power at 320 can roll for tens of kilometers before it slows to a crawl. The main thing fighting it isn't friction, it's air. At 320 kilometers per hour, the train is punching a 400-meter-long hole through the atmosphere, and the atmosphere pushes back hard. But as the train slows, the air resistance fades, and the coasting gets easier and easier. In other words, if the power dies and the driver does absolutely nothing, the train doesn't crash. It just gradually, smoothly, almost politely runs out of speed. But wait, if there's no electricity, how do you stop it on purpose? Don't the brakes need power? This is where the engineering gets genuinely clever. And it's built on an idea that dates back more than 150 years, to a man named George Westinghouse. Westinghouse looked at trains and asked a simple question: what should happen when things break? And his answer changed transportation forever. He designed a brake system where compressed air holds the brakes off. Power and pressure are what keep the train rolling freely. The moment the system fails, the moment a hose bursts or a connection dies, the brakes apply on their own. Engineers call this fail-safe. The failure itself triggers the safety. Modern bullet trains use the same philosophy. At full speed, they mostly brake using their own electric motors running in reverse as generators, dumping the train's energy back into the power line. But underneath that, every single car carries friction brakes driven by compressed air stored in tanks on board. Those tanks don't care what the overhead wire is doing. Dead wire, live wire, no wire at all. The air is already there, waiting. So a bullet train that loses power doesn't lose its brakes. If anything, it becomes easier to stop. Because stopping is the one thing the whole machine is designed to do without help. And now for the part I mentioned at the beginning. The trains lose power on purpose, constantly. Japan's electrical grid has a strange quirk. The eastern half of the country runs on 50 Hz. The western half runs on 60 Hz. Different frequencies, different power systems, and a bullet train line that runs straight through both. On top of that, power comes from different substations along the route, and those sections can't touch each other electrically. So the line is broken up by gaps called dead sections. Stretches of wire with no power in them at all. Every time a Shinkansen crosses one, the pantograph is sliding along a dead wire, and for a moment, the entire train is coasting at 320 kilometers per hour with no power whatsoever. It happens over and over, every single trip. The train sails through on momentum, picks up the next live section, and keeps going. Nobody on board has any idea, which means the scary scenario in this video's title, a bullet train losing power at full speed, is not an emergency. It's a Tuesday. But now let's raise the stakes. Because there is a version of this that engineers genuinely lose sleep over. Not the power dying. The reason the power died. March 11th, 2011. 2:46 in the afternoon. Off the northeast coast of Japan, the seafloor ruptures. Magnitude 9.0. The most powerful earthquake in the country's recorded history. The kind of event that moves the entire island of Honshu 2.5 meters to the east. At that exact moment, there are 27 bullet trains running on the Tohoku Shinkansen line. Some of them are doing around 270 kilometers per hour, directly toward the region that is about to be torn apart. Here's the problem with earthquakes and trains. A train at full speed cannot stop quickly. Even with every brake locked, a Shinkansen at 300 needs several kilometers to stand still. If violent shaking hits while the train is still at speed, the rails can twist underneath it, and no braking system on Earth can save it. You cannot outrun an earthquake, but it turns out you can outrun part of one. Earthquakes send out two kinds of waves. The first, called P waves, travel fast but are relatively gentle. The destructive shaking comes second in the slower S waves. There's a gap between them, sometimes just a few seconds. And Japan built an entire defense system inside that gap. Seismometers along the coast detected the P waves and did something brutally simple. They cut the power to the train line. No committee, no phone call, no human decision. The grid itself became the alarm. And every one of those 27 trains, the instant its pantograph went dead, automatically slammed on its emergency brakes. The trains had between 9 and 12 seconds of braking before the violent shaking arrived. 12 seconds doesn't sound like much. At those speeds, it's enough to shed a huge amount of energy before the ground starts moving. The result, of all the bullet trains running in service that day, the number that derailed was 0. The number of passengers killed was 0. The number injured was 0. The same afternoon, a tsunami killed more than 18,000 people. Every single person riding a bullet train walked away. Because somebody, decades earlier, decided that a dead power line should mean stop everything, right now, ask questions later. The power loss wasn't the disaster. The power loss was the rescue. And Japan had already learned this lesson the hard way. 7 years earlier, in 2004, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake struck Niigata Prefecture, with almost no warning, directly underneath a running Shinkansen. The quake was too close. The gap between the waves was too short. 8 of the train's 10 cars left the rails at around 200 kilometers per hour. And still, nobody died. Nobody was even seriously hurt. The train stayed upright, ground along the concrete for about 1.5 kilometers, and stopped. It remains the only time in history a Shinkansen has ever derailed with passengers on board. Engineers responded by bolting guide devices under the cars, designed to catch the rail and keep a derailed train from wandering. They treated their luckiest day as a warning. So if the train stops safely, is that the end of the story? Not quite. Because there's a difference between stopping safely and stopping somewhere good. And this is where things can still go very wrong. Not with physics, with people. December 18th, 2009. The Channel Tunnel, between France and England. 5 high-speed Eurostar trains enter the tunnel that night, coming out of one of the coldest snowstorms northern France had seen in years. The trains are covered in fine powdery snow, and the tunnel below the sea is warm, around 25 degrees Celsius. The snow that had worked its way into the electrical compartments hits that warm, humid air and melts. Condensation forms on the power electronics. And one by one, inside the tunnel, the trains die. Not a crash, not a fire. Just 5 trains, more than 2,000 passengers, sitting dead in a concrete tube under the English Channel. In the dark, the backup batteries drained. The lights went out. The air grew stale and hot, because the tunnel holds its warmth like an oven. Passengers stripped off winter coats they'd needed an hour earlier on a snowy platform in Paris. Toilets stopped working. Phones had no signal, 40 meters under the seabed, and there was almost no information because the crews barely knew more than the passengers did. Some people were trapped down there for hours before rescue locomotives could drag the dead trains out. One train's passengers ended up evacuating on foot through the service tunnel. The whole mess stranded tens of thousands of travelers in the days before Christmas and took the better part of a week to untangle. An independent review afterward tore into the operator, not for the breakdown itself, but for having no real plan for what to do with 2,000 human beings inside a dead train under the sea. And that's the honest answer about what happens when a bullet train loses power. The train is fine. The physics are fine. The hard part is 300 people, stopped in a tunnel or on a viaduct 20 meters above a rice field, with no air conditioning in August, wondering what's going on. That's why the newest bullet trains carry serious battery packs, not to keep running at speed. The batteries can't come close to that. They exist to solve the human problem. Keep the lights on, keep the toilets working, keep air moving, and crucially, let the train crawl at low speed out of a tunnel or off a bridge to somewhere it can be evacuated. After 2011, Japanese operators looked at their nightmare scenario, a train stranded in a long tunnel after a quake, and decided the answer was a train that can rescue itself. There's one more question worth asking. If my train goes dead on the tracks, what about the train behind me? At 320 kilometers per hour, there's another bullet train just a few minutes back. Does it come plowing into the wreckage? No. And the reason is the same fail-safe idea applied to signaling. Bullet train lines don't rely on a driver looking out the window. At 320, by the time you see something, you've already hit it. Instead, the track is divided into electronic blocks, and the system constantly tells every train the maximum speed it's allowed. The track detects trains through electrical circuits running in the rails themselves, and those circuits are wired backwards, on purpose. A healthy, empty block sends a signal. A block with a train in it goes silent. So if the power fails, if a cable is cut, if a rat chews through a wire somewhere, the block goes silent too, and silence means the same thing as danger. Stop. But let's push it further. Let's say the power dies, and at the same moment the driver has a heart attack. Now you have a dead train and an unconscious human at 320 kilometers per hour. Surely now it's a catastrophe. Still no. The driver's controls include what railroaders have called, for over a century, a dead man's switch. The driver has to actively hold it and respond to the system to keep the train moving. Stop responding, and the train assumes the worst and brakes on its own. The train doesn't need the driver to stop it. The train needs the driver to convince it, continuously, not to. The engineers arranged the entire railway so that every possible failure collapses toward the same outcome. Everything stops. Silence, on a railway, is treated as danger. The default state of a bullet train is not motion. It's standing still. Motion is the exception, granted second by second, only while every system agrees that it's safe. Compare that with a car. A car at highway speed with a dead engine still has a human steering it, a human whose last driving lesson may have been 30 years ago. A bullet train with a dead wire has 100 years of paranoid engineering steering it, all of it pointing the same direction, towards zero, which leads to the strangest conclusion in this whole story. In more than 60 years of operation, carrying over 10 billion passengers. The Japanese Shinkansen has never had a single passenger fatality from a derailment or collision. Not one. Through earthquakes, typhoons, blackouts, blizzards, and every power failure you can imagine. People sometimes call that a miracle. It isn't. A miracle is when you get lucky. This is the opposite of luck. This is thousands of engineers, across 3 generations, sitting in rooms asking the same grim question over and over. What happens when this breaks? And refusing to build it until the answer was, the train stops. So here's what actually happens if a bullet train loses power at 320 kilometers per hour. The lights dim for half a second. The hum under the floor fades. The train coasts, quiet and level, through fields or tunnels or the edges of a city. Somewhere up front, a driver watches the speed bleed away. Air hisses into brake cylinders that have been waiting, charged and patient, for exactly this moment. And 700 tons of steel roll gently down through 300, 200, 100, and settle to a stop. Inside, someone looks up from their coffee and checks their watch. That's it. That's the disaster. The train was never the dangerous part. The speed was never the dangerous part. The dangerous part was always the question hiding underneath. Did anyone plan for the day it all goes wrong? On a bullet train, somebody did? Decades ago. And they planned it so well that when the worst finally happens, at 200 miles per hour, with 300 lives on board, it feels like nothing at all. The power dies, the train stops, everyone goes home, and honestly, in a world full of machines that fail loudly, there's something almost moving about a machine designed to fail this quietly.